welcome to yet another edition of the California Society of Anesthesiologists Vital Times podcast. I am Dr. Ludwig Lin, your host, and today we are going to talk about collegiality and interdisciplinary cooperation with two physicians from California's Kaiser system. Dr. Charles Hummel is the Kaiser Permanente Southern California Regional Physician Director for Patient Safety. He is a practicing obstetrician gynecologist. He also leads the Collegiality project at KP Los Angeles Medical Center, which has focused on cultivating and improving interdepartmental relationships amongst physicians. And his work with Collegiality has been a springboard for patient safety and team steps as a master trainer. Dr. Jason Cheng is an anesthesiologist and the medical director for safety with the Permanente Federation, overseeing patient safety as the physician director for the Kaiser Permanente National Organization. He is also a proud member of the ASA's Committees on Patient Safety Education and Well-Being, and a new member of the Anesthesia Quality Institute's Anesthesia Incident Reporting System Advisory Committee. I'd like to thank both Dr. Hummel and Dr. Cheng for taking the time to record this podcast conversation. And we'll just start out this conversation very broadly. I'd like to ask both Charles and Jason how they came to be involved in a project like this and its impact on them personally and on a professional level. Go ahead, guys.
Well, Ludwig, thank you so much for having me on. I am a big fan of this podcast, and I've listened very intently before. You know, for me, collegiality was something that I really started thinking about when I was a resident physician at the Hospital of UPenn in Philadelphia. And during residency, I was, at first amazed by the grandeur of the institution. I was at an Ivy League. I had finished my MD PhD with flying colors from UCLA, and I was kind of ready to take the world by storm. And then I think, like a lot of people, the beginning of residency just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I recognized how much I had to learn and how little I knew and how low I was on this totem pole of medicine. And I felt reminded of it like every single day. And when I boiled down what was sort of the most challenging aspect of becoming a physician, particularly an OBGYN at a high acuity center with a lot of strong personalities, I realized that it came down to the relationships that we're in at work and how we or how we don't work together on challenging problems and how we come to understand the complexity of our patients together as a grounding force of humility. And I felt like that was really lacking. And the initial residency experiences that I had, where I watched patients have suboptimal outcomes. I even had a patient die under my watch. It was the Saturday after Thanksgiving. I can remember it like it was yesterday. I watched a patient die because our team couldn't get itself together and communicate like colleagues and approach the situation with ownership, professionalism, and with decency toward each other. And that was the moment I realized this was something that medicine was desperately in need of. And it kind of launched a whole sequence of events for me where instead of becoming a physician scientist, I decided to become sort of a social scientist of medicine.
That's powerful. So how did you go about doing that, Charles?
Well, and this is one of the things I say to residents all the time. Like, you often have an interesting platform as a trainee. And for me, I recognized that I had an opportunity to do resident research. And it turns out when you want to study social science and do it as research, you can often get initial results a lot quicker than when you're in the lab doing bench work. And so I decided to make my resident research project one around collegiality and how it linked to wellness and also patient outcomes. And I went and talked to some people that knew about sociology research and psychology research, and they guided me on how to just do an initial survey of all the house staff at the entire hospital. We asked them what their relationships were like with other physicians, but we really zeroed in on what was it like when you did consultations. Because what I had realized when I lost that patient that one day as a resident it was our inability to kind of talk across specialties, across disciplines, that really affected that patient's care. And it seemed to affect a lot of other complex patients. So we studied how consultation was viewed amongst house staff throughout the hospital. And then over the course of the next year, I helped lead a group of interventions for our OBGYN residents aimed at improving collegiality. So how you answer a phone for a consult, how you introduce yourself, how you invest in that relationship with the other person on the line, how you address your own wellness and your well-being. So we had a lot of interventions in our department centered around just helping the residents um, get together and be in fellowship and get to know other specialties. Um, and so when we got to the end of that year and resurveyed all the house staff in the entire hospital, they had a more favorable view of OBGYN, both in terms of how they communicated and whether there was respect and mutual respect, but also in terms of the perception that clinical care had improved. And we know there are data that support when clinicians feel the care has improved, that actually correlates with improved care. So it was kind of an exciting project to get to undertake, and I felt like we had just sort of scratched the surface at that point. There was so much more to do.
Right. But that was such a great way to really be able to pivot for yourself and how you felt about your profession. So, it sounds like it was a win-win. That's great. I have so many questions, but I feel like I need to hear about Jason's story and then we can all sort of talk about this together. So, Jason, how did you get involved in all of this?
Well, I was maybe really after I had joined Kaiser Permanente, within the first 3 to 4 months, I was asked to begin to take over a program that we had in Kaiser called Critical Event Team Training. We colloquially called it CETT. For all practical purposes, it was really basically simulation education. And what it was specifically was a program that we had developed where the entire OB team, including anesthesia, was working together, usually on some sort of cadence to develop and work through simulated OB crisis. Um, this was really kind of my first time, working and doing any type of interprofessional education, and it was something I had, obviously, learned about very quickly. At that time, the term that we really used for teamwork and communication was human factors education, which I've learned now is actually much, much broader than really just that. But it was really my entryway into just understanding this world around teamwork and communication, and really understanding interprofessional situational monitoring in ways that I don't think I've ever appreciated when I was in residency. Um, so my entry into patient safety world was completely, through doing this collaborative exercise as a safety leader from the anesthesiologist standpoint. I was paired immediately with an OB doctor. So you can kind of say in some ways I've kind of learned really about what teamwork and communication means as a team, uh, starting off immediately by working with obstetricians. It was really kind of very interesting because when I think about where we get burnout, when I think about where we become second victims, when I think about just fatigue, and when I think about really risk as an anesthesiologist, I can tell you the vast majority of my experiences over my career seem to all cross directly into the crosshairs of being on my nights, and crazy experiences with labor and delivery. So it doesn't surprise me, maybe 5, 6 years as I became more mature into this work, that somebody like Charles and myself would kind of join forces, for a much larger, effort around, I think, some of the really foundational elements, of what teamwork really means. And I'm just so thrilled that our two professions have been able to really work together for patient safety, but so much more than patient safety. It's really like to what Charles had said right from the get-go. It's really about understanding the nature and the power and the dynamic of relationships that I think catapults to everything else.
Totally hear what you guys are both saying. And I agree. It's incredible how much teamwork really goes into these moments of crises, right? And labor and delivery, there's a lot of potential for that. And it always stuns me when we don't have it because it's kind of like how is this even supposed to work? I'm fascinated by all of this because I'm personally very interested in understanding why we behave the way we do. And I had spent a couple of episodes of this podcast series exploring the concept of empathy deficit within medicine. That people within medicine seem to treat each other with a shocking lack of empathy and consideration, even though we all really need that. We need that extra level of grace, considering how much stress we're under. And I just think it's really awesome that you guys are actually talking about this and working on this on a professional level and trying to change culture that way. How has it gone for you as you attempted to do all of this? Charles, do you want to start?
I think as with anything that's a new initiative, it always starts slowly and it always happens in like three times slower the arc than you hope it would go. At least that's true for really anxious and impatient people like me. But I think that when we consider the work that we are now embarking on with this, where we've come, and Jason and I have been working on this together now for a little over 2 years. And at KP, we've been working on collegiality specifically in our Southern California region now for 5 to 6 years, both sort of at local medical centers and within our organization writ large. And it kind of just starts down with the basics. I mean, empathy itself is, putting yourself in another person's whole, mind and body and spiritual space and understanding where their feelings are coming from. And if that is ultimately what part of the deficit is, and Ludwig, I agree with you 100%. I think that a deficit of empathy across the board, a fatigue of empathy, is a huge issue. Then it means the intervention is kind of the equivalent of how do we look each other in the eyes. And with a pandemic that made that very challenging as we were getting this work going, one of the first sort of interventions that I've been a huge fan of is actually doing journal clubs between two departments that are having struggles. I'll give an example of how this is played out for us. We got general surgeons and emergency physicians in our medical center together. And that's a relationship that is easily strained if there is a lack of trust and if there are just sort of circumstances of bad luck, because the ED gets whatever rolls in and then needs help from consultant physicians to help address patients' problems. And ruling out an appendicitis, ruling out a cholecystitis is a huge part of that ED general surgeon relationship. And general surgeons feel very swamped at times and struggle. We got the two departments together who really had a negative view of each other prior to our interventions. They felt like they weren't listened to, they felt dismissed, and that feeling was kind of reciprocal. And we just said, let's talk about new trends in appendicitis of all things, right? And let's learn together. And it was amazing when you got the group together in a room. In fact, even before that, we had them together virtually. You could feel that the temperature went down like 5 degrees when people were just regarding each other as colleagues. There wasn't the stress of the moment of like, oh, they're consulting me now, and I've got to go to the OR with this other case, and don't they understand how hard we work? It was just, let's talk about how we're all clinical experts and how we can all work better together. And we found that journal club approach translated into all kinds of different relationships and really was a critical icebreaker to having people regard each other as qualified and capable physician humans.
That's brilliant. I really like that example, and that you were able to do something positive by instituting that. Um, Jason, how did you do when you first tried to, broach this area? Do you have any like personal experiences to share, or any thoughts about, how your own views or attitudes changed as you started working in this space?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I think, to kind of your previous point, Ludwig, around empathy, I kind of, I don't know, I hope it may be a little bit different now, but I kind of feel almost like when you went into medicine, which is probably like the most humanizing, at least one of, I think one of the most humanizing fields, if there is, it's probably what brought all of us in here, is how there seems to be some sort of acceptance or some sort of requirement of that dehumanizing aspect, especially when we're going through our training. And I kind of remember, at least I'm a third generation physician, and my father, my aunt, my uncles, they were all physicians. I remember how, they wanted me to read The House of God, by Samuel Shem. Exactly right. Exactly. Um, and I just sometimes do wonder if how much of our training and the indoctrination and the enculturation of what we go through in some ways sets us up, for obviously all the things that we talk about these days, such as burnout and, safety obviously is really kind of the sharp end, when people and the systems are actually burned out without us even realizing it until a horrific event happens. So I do kind of wonder, sometimes really the antidote to burnout and and the best medicine, the best prescription really for taking better care of our patients is actually us taking better care of ourselves. And when I mean ourselves, I mean collectively, kind of like to what Charles is saying, um, the M&Ms or journal clubs. In my situation, it was the interdisciplinary, interprofessional simulation training. I think what really it kind of brought to life in me was even though we may be working together, on a day-to-day basis, are we really, working as one? It's kind of like when I see kids and, kids, I have a little toddler and I see him play and I kind of wonder sometimes, are we actually really playing together in the sandbox or is it more like parallel play? But the problem and then the danger behind that is sometimes we don't realize we're not on the same page. And it could be, on either a micro level, such as, the management of a potential need for urgent C-section and, maybe the epidural is working, not working, I'm not sure. I mean, that could be like a daily thing, right? But even on a larger, I think from even a larger standpoint, this is, I think, what Charles and I started to realize. And, the wonderful articles, that Lisa Rosenbaum written about is a deeper understanding that maybe we don't train together or we need to find more opportunities to really hear each other out, and create that psychological safety for us to say, I'm not really totally comfortable. But yet sometimes maybe we're not allowed to say that to ourselves, much less to other people that we're supposed to, look professional and imperfect in front of all the time.
Yes, for sure. The next question I want to pose to both of you is this. So, these projects to improve collegiality, it definitely sounds like there are two different endpoints and they're both very important. But I was wondering which one you've been more effective at achieving. It sounds like this is going to be something that helps with patient safety because, hey, when different disciplines work together better, it's going to provide for better care. But it's also going to improve morale, decrease burnout. Have you noticed any difference in impact in one versus the other? Can you elaborate for me? Let's start with Charles again.
Yeah, certainly. I think when we've looked at our data and looked at sort of standing data sets that we get on our physicians, we get regarding our physicians, it's clear that the spaces where we've worked on this, we see improvements with well-being and with morale. Within our system, we do surveys of all our workforce twice a year, and in spaces where we've been working on this, we have seen improvements. The improvements are seen in areas like psychological safety and in teamwork and in trust of leadership and trust of each other. Now, I think whenever you look at those results, you have to also look with humility and say, are there other factors that have been at play where have been emerging from a pandemic? We are at a somewhat better spot, although not optimal in terms of physician well-being, nationally. But there have been other interventions as well. So I don't know where the needle will finally land in terms of what the specific return on investment is in terms of physician well-being. But it's clear that we see positive signals in the spaces where we do this work, both through our own surveys and surveys that our organization does. I think when it comes to patient safety, it's a harder question to answer right now because patient safety is so multifactorial and represents the most complex aspects of the work that we do in medicine. And what I mean by that is right now, for example, we've been looking at improving fire and burn risk safety. It's a huge initiative for OR safety, as you both know well. And it's hard to know if what we're doing is ultimately lowering the endpoint rates of whether people get burned or a fire starts, in part because when you raise awareness of a specific issue, then you raise the incidence of reporting on that issue. So we have so many more reports of things as people are aware of it. So that reporting bias, I think, has made it hard for us to know what the impacts are for this on patient safety and those endpoints of sentinel events. I know from my empirical observations when I've had extended conversations with patients, both in my capacity as a frontline physician, but also as an administrative physician, that patients are very in tune to whether clinicians are collaborating or not, and whether they're collaborating or not well, and whether they're speaking ill or well of each other as physicians. Probably not surprising that patients pick up on that. And so that observation, which has been borne out in many other venues, I think is another really important. It's the third piece I'm adding here, Ludwig. And we'll just round out the quintuple aim while we're at it, right?
Sounds good.
What I would say is what I have noticed also really kind of empirically. I've had the opportunity, to be able to do this work, not just with obstetricians, but also, with a variety of different surgeons. What we had started our interprofessional simulation education program, primarily between OB and anesthesia. But we've actually had pockets where we've actually seen perioperative other specialties doing simulation training in our operating rooms across, at least in Southern California's Kaiser Permanente system. So now what may have started off with OB and anesthesia really has kind of spearheaded now toward other, surgical specialists, orthopedics, urology, general surgeon. And what I've noticed is even if you don't do that many interprofessional simulation trainings, um, just even doing a few and making sure that it's facilitated well, that really kind of gets that ahas and the open eyes and my gosh, I never really thought of it that way. Types of reactions, that you get are very, very profound. And in terms of just really kind of seeing like the outcomes, now when I do hear of a, harrowing placenta accreta, for instance, that was a massive hemorrhage and just harrowing 3, 6, 4 hour operations with blood loss and the usual craziness. What we start hearing more and more is actually them sharing these stories not as bad outcomes that nobody wants to talk about, but really as resilient episodes in which they did everything great, and even though it was horrible and they were basically just handed a horrific situation, everybody handled it well, and everybody came out feeling more pride, more proud, and feeling like their training and the culture and the communication. And many times, I would hear that they credit the simulation training. Maybe it might have been, the Journal Club or the M&M. So I think really ensuring to continue to keep putting the pulse, and putting the people together, not in, just emergency situations, but really even debriefing, after emergent situations, using every opportunity to really be able to just get the team to just come together, slow down, process, and think about what happened, and start first and foremost with just thanking the team for what they've just been through. I think it's really powerful. And one of the things that I've always kind of mentioned is, at least in patient safety, it's really a product of two things. It's really a product of the systems, which is about the stuff, the workflows, and all the things you could see, touch, and feel, right? But it's a product of the systems and the culture, and to the effect that people are really the ones who guide the culture, leaders drive the culture. I think just seeing this level of effort by leaders such as the anesthesiologists and OB, doctors working side by side, that's the biggest driver of that culture piece. So if the culture and the systems are, iteratively improving and trying to work out the kinks, I think that's a great direction to show. Ultimately, you're driving more and more towards greater safety and less harm.
That sounds good. I wanted to follow up on all of this, and I'm trying to figure out how to best pose my question. When when I was talking to a anthropology professor during that podcast on empathy deficit, he's from UCLA and he actually studies empathy as his academic niche. I also was speaking with a intensivist and a psychiatrist. One of the things that we were pointing to as a cause for the loss of empathy was just how busy people are nowadays and how tired people are, and perhaps people just don't have enough emotional reserves left to be empathetic. And I think what I want to ask the two of you is, by instituting these various workshops that promote collegiality, it sounds to me like you have not reduced people's workload, yet you were able to foster more collegiality. Would that be correct? Or did you give people a little bit more time and assume that they're going to be a bit less productive and had less production pressure?
Well, Ludwig, I'm sure where you work and where we all work. It's hard to imagine that production pressure would be lessened just to write. Like, but with that said, and this sort of is one of the big learnings at when you work together in a productive way, you can get more efficient and you can become more reliable, and it can feel like less work. Now that might sound like some administrative doublespeak, so I'm going to catch myself before fully fully frontline physicians don't come after me with their pitchforks. Um, I think it's a yes and. It's a yes, we see there are subjective and perhaps objective improvements in how people view their workloads and how they view their relationships and how the two really do have a lot of connection. And at the same time, this is why Jason and I are constantly going on a new tangent in the work that we're doing together. We see technology as being a huge part of how we can, I think, bend the production pressure curves for people and still be seeking safety and collegiality and community. So we're working really hard right now from the lens of safety and culture on thinking about how we can use artificial intelligence and how we can not be caught off guard as artificial intelligence and its applications to medicine come into play. I don't want to divert us on a whole discussion of artificial intelligence completely, but just to say that anybody that's trying to kind of work on physician well-being and wellness and experience and how it spills into everything else should be thinking about the technological advances that are both in our midst and will soon be in our midst, and think of those as powerful allies in our work, not as hindrances. And I think that's a bit of a departure from where we have been with technology. Like if you think of a lot of the technology we've seen within the three of our careers, all of us being not new now into this, I'm sorry to say, um, we we saw the electronic health record come into full force, and in fact, it had created more work than less work, and more ways to find out information, but not easier ways necessarily. And now, finally, with generative AI, there's an idea that the layers of just extra work and more things might start to be more peeled back. And then, with the space that that gives us, can we fill that in with productive relational elements of our practice? That's the big grand hope, isn't it?
Intriguing. We'll see. Yeah, we'll see how it all plays out. I like it.
Yeah. Charles brings a really interesting point. I think, if you step back and think about, healthcare in general, in many of my colleagues in patient safety, we talk a lot about how healthcare is really just this complex system, right? We talk about systems a lot. And one of the things that's interesting, I recently heard another colleague, talk about systems engineers will frequently kind of look and they'll observe healthcare and they'll observe, our work and say, a lot of other industries, they very proactively engineer safety systems. But what he said was, but in healthcare, it doesn't seem as though we are a system that's engineered. We're more like a system where things, people, and work are all just kind of cobbled and mashed together. I kind of laughed when I heard that, and I said, "That's actually kind of true." But I think one of the real important aspects, and I'm happy why Charles, brought up technology, and as we think about obviously AI, is when you have a complex systems comes with a cognitive burden and cognitive work. Um, that really affects us. And I think sometimes we don't necessarily really take the time, or we don't really maybe have the science to really understand how the ever increasing cognitive load that is placed just even in our clinical work, the cognitive load in terms of the decision making, the cognitive load when we are trying to have collegial conversations, but how poor is a cognitive load when we're having, some of those pebbles in our shoes and having to deal with that, on a day to day basis. And, being able to really maybe, tease out, what is the cognitive stuff that, we can really approach maybe more rationally, and how does technology potentially play a role in being able to lessen that cognitive load so we can really kind of focus on, building relationships, with our colleagues, building relationships, with our patients, and ultimately building relationships back with ourselves to reclaim maybe what sometimes we kind of lose in all of this. So I think it's really interesting to think about this from a cognitive standpoint.
I think overload is a really good term. I mean, there are so many things happening in our clinical sphere that it could be overwhelming at times, right? So definitely something for system engineers to think about. Charles, did you have any more thoughts about this topic?
Well, yeah, and it's as Jason was saying that I immediately thought to one of our most successful interventions we actually had, or successful kind of medical center wide workshops that my colleagues and I did on collegiality, and the topic of it came out of a planning session where we were sitting down and we said, okay, we're going to cover psychological safety in these different ways, and we were all getting overwhelmed with all of the Teams messages, emails. Somebody was open on the Epic EMR and was getting secure chat messages about patients. Like this was just happening in real time, and we said we're just so overloaded we can't even plan the session. And then in that moment, we recognized, well, maybe there's something to this whole cognitive overload thing and how it links up with our collegiality. And we created a workshop for all of our physicians that actually focused on how could you set appropriate and approved boundaries on various platforms to keep your sanity, but also to streamline the effectiveness of your communication and to give yourself those cognitive breaks that are so important for safety and reliability in our frontline clinical work.
Well, that sounds so ideal. Did it work?
So we have seen steady improvements in the perception of sort of practice support, and they're confounded by the fact that we now use an ambient AI tool as well in our organization. So that's one point that has to be made off to the side. But when we got comments in the months after physician said, thank you so much for that talk about overload. I've subsequently learned how to set out of office on my email, put up banners on my Teams, disable my chat function here, put my preferred contact info in the right places. It's been an overwhelming response. So I don't have statistics for you on that yet, but I can tell you that the grassroots, just the groundswell of enthusiasm and of gratitude around that has been really positive.
That's really heartwarming. And this segues nicely into the next question I had for you, because what I wanted to ask you was about institutional support. And I feel like, especially with this cognitive overload, you know, these requirements by institutions to respond to a certain type of email within a certain number of hours, this and that, that could be very daunting. And we're all professionals. We all have very high expectations ourselves. So if those are the rules, we're going to follow them, right? So I sort of feel like in order to be able to set some boundaries in terms of minimizing the overload, one does require some institutional support as well. So did you guys work on that? Did you have to work on that? Was there pushback? Was it easy to align the institution in terms of these efforts? Tell me more.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, yes, and yes. It's been challenging, and we've been working on getting institutional support, and we have accomplished quite a bit, and we have still a ways to go. And what we recognized as we worked on collegiality specifically was that to get people to come to a meeting, to get people to, engage, it takes that leadership support and it takes that leadership sponsorship. And as we took the work we did at our local medical center on collegiality and combined it and connected it with what was being done at all our different medical centers, our 15 or so medical centers in Southern California, serving 5 million patients. We recognized the places where the work was the most successful and the most broad-based in its scope and in its extent was places where the equivalent of like an executive VP of a hospital was overseeing the work. And so we recognize that when you had people in significant leadership positions, that gave us both the money, but also a person's time and their influence to implement programs. And what I'm excited to share is that we had long sought the opportunity to speak to new physicians within our organization about collegiality during their onboarding orientation days. And they have them spaced out over the first 3 years that physicians joined the Southern California Permanente Medical Group.
Okay.
And we had the opportunity to present a 2-hour program on collegiality to all of those new physicians with care actors acting out scenarios relating specifically to collegiality, where we went over and really our greatest hits of the material. And all of that was made possible by support at the highest levels of our organization, having our chief wellness officer, our assistant executive medical director over people and culture fully sponsoring the work and providing the necessary funding to get care actors together, to book space at a hotel, conference center. So we have recognized the importance and the value and necessity of the institutional support and buy-in to get to the next step. And what we're excited about with regards to this onboarding work is that we piloted it and the response was positive, and now it's going to be a fixed part of the onboarding that we do.
Perfect. That's wonderful. So I am so ready to talk about all of this for like another hour. And I think we're going to have to do a part two for this conversation, which I totally wouldn't mind at all. So maybe I could wrap up part one by asking you, Charles, a follow up question about this. And Jason, feel free to jump in as well. I feel like a institution that is like Kaiser and is aware of all aspects of a patient's flow through the system, they are probably most likely to recognize the advantage of committing to collegiality projects. So when you guys are talking to somebody who is not part of a institution like that, yet who want to get collegiality projects started, do you have any advice on how they go about trying to convince the institution that this is worth investing in? Because that sort of takes a big picture view.
It absolutely does. And a few things come to mind. I think the first is thank you. Thank you for being interested in this. And you should thank yourself for being interested in this, because I have found that when you get started on this work, even if it's sometimes lonely, there's something that's heartwarming about focusing on good interactions between people. So that's the first thing. The second is that you really only need to start small. And I recommend starting small because the first things you want to do on collegiality are also your first data points, or your first prospective data points on, what's going on and how you're doing. So the idea of just starting a journal club, and I don't mean just, because everything that you want to do takes some degree of planning, and we as physicians are not necessarily the best planners always. But getting two departments together for a journal club, I'd start there and just say, can we get together? Can we have a lunch meeting? Can we have an early morning meeting? Maybe start virtual if you have to, and try that out. I think that's a great first step. And another great first step is just get two departments together and have a meal. Have it be a lunchtime. If you want to go bold, have a dinner time. There's a lot of evidence out there in the wellness community that commensality, or sharing a meal, can go a long, long way to improving relationships. And then you start there and you build on it.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't agree more. I actually want to share a quote because for me, I think Charles absolutely, said it important is first of all, bring people together, right? It almost sounds a little paradoxical in the healthcare system. We're all about bringing people together, but we really intentionally, bring people together. And what I would say is when you bring people together, you have to have a reason. And I think starting with a story, whether it is a story of maybe a bad outcome that people really need to process and talk about, in a safe space. Maybe it's a good story, maybe it's a near miss, and people want to like say, hey, wow, I wish that happened all the time. Here's a quote actually by Sidney Decker. Everybody in the patient safety world really knows. And I really love this quote because I think it speaks to a story being a launch pad for really understanding, I think, some of the complexities in the work and allowing us to really explore what some of the larger challenges are. The line from Sidney Decker is, underneath every seemingly obvious, simple story, there is a second, deeper story, a more complex story, a story about the system in which people work and thrive through together. And I think it's really meaningful. And I think one of the things to your other point also is really how to be able to get leadership, or how do you be able to institutionalize collegiality? I think starting with a story and then unpacking all the different layers in which maybe there were system issues that needed to be addressed and nobody really thought about, or they just glossed over. Maybe there are stories about some real friction maybe between departments. OB and anesthesia would be a great example of frictions that may exist, and
Yeah.
our patients, unfortunately, are the ones, who are the first victims when, these frictions, become jagged edges. But we become second victims, of this kind of friction because we live in this world every single day. So that would really be my suggestion: is think about a story that has some meaning and then start really diving into what are the different layers. And sometimes that's when you suddenly start realizing, my gosh, maybe we do need to do this, team steps training, or interprofessional collegial education. Maybe we need to talk about some other of these social, as well as systemic, challenges that maybe we're needing to, be able to address. And I think that's a real important aspect of it.
I'm super inspired by all of this conversation. I think it's great, and like I said, we are going to definitely have to do a part two and get into more details about these projects and talk through more scenarios. So I'm going to bring part one to a close right now. Charles, Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And this has been another episode for the California Society of Anesthesiologists Vital Times podcast. Follow us, subscribe to these podcasts, and look for the next episode. All right, take care.